What if the greatest king Israel ever knew began not with a crown, but with a cave and a broken heart? What drives a man to rise from betrayal, scandal, and civil war to become a symbol of divine promise? This isn't just the story of David. It's the story of leadership, redemption, and a kingdom that would echo into eternity. The second book of Samuel, the story that changed the destiny of Israel. Story of David begins in tragedy and ends in glory. From the shepherd's field to the battlefield, from caves to palaces, this young shepherd became the greatest king Israel had ever known. The second book of Samuel tells us how David went from a fugitive to the monarch of a united and powerful nation. Let's follow the early steps of this incredible journey, which began in tears over the death of a king and ended with the establishment of a new capital that would be remembered forever in history. This is the story of a man after God's own heart, with his victories, trials, and the divine hand guiding each step along the path to the throne of Israel. 3 days had passed since the battle on Mount Gilboa. David and his men had just returned to Ziklag after defeating the Amalekites who had raided the city. The camp was bustling when a man appeared. His clothes were torn, and he had dirt on his head, clear signs of deep mourning. He ran to David and fell face down in respect. "Where have you come from?" David asked, curious and a bit uneasy about this unexpected arrival. The young man replied that he had escaped from the Israelite camp. David's heart raced. What happened? "Tell me," he urged. What came next hit David like a series of arrows. The people fled from the battle, and many fell and died. Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. We see in 2 Samuel 1-4 how David responded to this news. Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" The messenger, an Amalekite, told a story that seemed a little too convenient. He claimed to have found Saul wounded, leaning on his spear, and that the king had asked him to finish the job. In 2 Samuel 1:10, he says, "So I stood over him and killed him because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my lord." The young man was probably expecting a reward for eliminating David's enemy. But David's reaction was nothing like the Amalekite expected. Instead of celebrating, David tore his clothes in deep mourning. All his men did the same. The entire camp was engulfed in sorrow. In 2 Samuel 1:12 we read, "They mourned and wept, and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword." And what about the messenger who proudly claimed to have delivered the final blow to Saul? David saw no heroism in his actions, only a terrible crime. In 2 Samuel 1:14, David asks with a stern voice, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" He then ordered one of his young soldiers to strike the Amalekite down. In 2 Samuel 1:16, David declares, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" Amid his grief, David composed a beautiful lament for Saul and Jonathan. This poem, known as the Song of the Bow, was taught to the people of Judah and recorded in the book of Jashar. In 2 Samuel 1:19, David begins his lament. "A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel. How the mighty have fallen." He pleaded that it not be told in Gath, nor published in the streets of Ashkelon, so the daughters of the Philistines wouldn't rejoice. David cursed the mountains of Gilboa, wishing no dew or rain upon them where the mighty had fallen. With deep emotion, he expresses in 2 Samuel 1:23, "Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions." The lament ends with touching words about Jonathan. In 2 Samuel 1:26, David says, "I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women." The young shepherd whom Saul had tried to kill so many times was now sincerely weeping for the death of the one who had pursued him, revealing the greatness of his character. After the period of mourning, David sought divine direction for his next step. He did not act out of impulse or personal ambition. In 2 Samuel 2-1, we see his posture of dependence. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. Obedient, David went to Hebron with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. His men followed him, each with his family, and they settled in the towns around Hebron. In 2 Samuel 2-3 we read, David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. It didn't take long for the men of Judah to come to Hebron. There, in a solemn ceremony, they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. It was a historic moment, though still partial. Only one of the 12 tribes recognized him as sovereign. 2 Samuel 2-4 records it. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. Soon after, David received word of an act of bravery and loyalty. The men of Jabesh Gilead had risked their lives to recover the bodies of Saul and his sons, which had been exposed on the walls of Bethshan. With dignity, they cremated the remains and buried the bones under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh, fasting for 7 days in mourning. This gesture deeply touched David's heart. He sent messengers to thank those loyal men. In 2 Samuel 25-5-6 we read, David sent messengers to the men of Jabes to say to them, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul, your master, by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this." David took the opportunity to announce his anointing as king over Judah, urging them to be strong and courageous. It was a subtle yet clear invitation. He hoped that all the tribes would eventually recognize him as king. In Hebron, David began to establish his rule. In verse 11 of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, we learn that he would remain in this city for 7 years and 6 months. During this period, several of his sons were born. His firstborn was Amnon, son of Ahinoam. The second was Caleb, son of Abigail. The third was Absalom, son of Maacah, daughter of Talmi, king of Geshur. Also born were Adnijah, son of Haggith, Shepashah, son of Abidal, and Ithram, son of Egler, as recorded in verses 2-5 of chapter 3 of 2 Samuel. While David was being anointed king in Hebron, another king was being proclaimed in the north. Abner, Saul's powerful general and cousin, was not willing to hand over the throne to David's house. He took Ishbosheth, Saul's surviving son, and brought him to Mahanaim across the Jordan River, there, beyond the reach of the Philistines, who now controlled parts of Israel. Abner proclaimed Ishbosheth king over the northern tribes. In verses 8 and 9 of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, the biblical text tells us, "Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Asher, Israel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Thus, a deep division was created within the nation. Judah followed David while the rest of Israel followed Saul's son. Ishbosheth was 40 years old when he began to reign and ruled for only 2 years. His reign was weak, sustained mainly by Abner's strength and influence. In verse 10 of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, we read, "Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to David." The stage was set for confrontation. Civil war became inevitable when the armies of the 2 kings met near the pool of Gibeon. Joab, David's nephew, and the commander of his army came from Hebron with his men. On the other side, Abner and the servants of Ishbosheth came from Mahanaim. When they met, Abner proposed a contest between the young warriors. But suddenly joy turned to tragedy. When they reached the threshing floor of Nacon, something unexpected happened. In 2 Samuel 66, we read, "When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled." It seemed like a natural reflex. The oxen stumbled, the ark was at risk of falling, and Uzzah simply tried to steady it, but the result was devastating. In 2 Samuel 6-7, the consequences laid out. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. The shock was overwhelming. The music stopped. The dancers froze. A heavy silence fell over the crowd that just moments earlier had been celebrating so joyfully. Uzzah's death showed everyone that the ark was not just a symbol. It was truly holy, and approaching it required deep reverence and care. David was disturbed by what had happened in 2 Samuel 6-8. We see his reaction. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. The name means outburst against Uzzah, forever marking the place of the tragedy. This experience awakened a profound fear in David. The king who had faced giants, lions, and armies now trembled before the presence of God. In 2 Samuel 6-9, he voiced his fear. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" The festive procession had become a somber funeral. The first attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem had ended in tragic failure. David decided not to go through with it, at least not for now. In 2 Samuel 6:10, we read, "He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Odom, the Gittite." What should have been a day of joy and celebration ended in confusion and grief. David realized that he had tried to do the right thing, but in the wrong way. The law of Moses was clear. The ark was to be carried not on a cart, but on the shoulders of the Levites using specially made poles. In his excitement, David had overlooked God's instructions, and the result was disastrous. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one. Even with the best intentions, we cannot ignore God's commands. The ark would remain in the house of Obed-Edom for a while, until David learned the right way to bring it to Jerusalem. The ark of the Lord stayed at the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months. What might have seemed like a burden or a danger to many turned out to be a great blessing for this man and his family. In 2 Samuel 6:11, we read the outcome of this special stay. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Odom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. News of these blessings reached King David. In 2 Samuel 6:12, we read, "Now King David was told, 'The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God.'" This reignited David's desire to bring the ark to Jerusalem. This time, however, David carefully studied how to do it the right way. In 1 Chronicles, which provides additional details about this event, we see in chapter 15-2 how David acknowledged his previous mistake. Then David said, "No one but the Levites may carry the ark of God because the Lord chose them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister before him forever." David prepared everything with much greater care. He gathered the Levites and the priests, purified them according to the law, and gave clear instructions on how the ark was to be transported. In 1 Chronicles 15:11-15, we see how David followed God's instructions properly. This time in 2 Samuel 6:13, we see the beginning of the new procession. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. David wasn't taking any chances. Every 6 steps he offered sacrifices to ensure God's blessing on this second attempt. Joy returned stronger than ever. In 2 Samuel 6:14, we witness David's passionate devotion. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. The king didn't care about royal dignity. He only wanted to express his joy and gratitude before God. It was a triumphant procession. In 2 Samuel 6:15 we read, "While he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets." Imagine the scene. Thousands of people climbing the hills of Jerusalem, shouting for joy with trumpets echoing through the valley. It was a day no one would ever forget. Finally, the ark arrived in the city of David. In 2 Samuel 6:17, we see the climactic moment. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. The mission was complete. The ark, symbol of God's presence, was now in Jerusalem. To celebrate this special moment, David blessed the people and distributed gifts. In 2 Samuel 6:18, we read, "After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty." And in the next verse, "Then he gave a loaf of bread, a date cake, and a raisin cake to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their homes." With the ark finally in Jerusalem, David still felt that something was missing. He lived in a beautiful cedar palace while the ark of God remained in a simple tent. This deeply troubled the king. He wanted to build a worthy house for the Lord, a magnificent temple that reflected God's glory. In 2 Samuel 7:1, we see how this thought emerged. After the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, David finally had peace and prosperity. It seemed like the perfect time to carry out this great project. The king shared his idea with the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel 7:2. He confided, "Here I am living in a house of cedar while the ark of God remains in a tent." The comparison revealed how uncomfortable David felt with the situation. It seemed unfair for him to enjoy such comfort while the symbol of God's presence was housed so modestly. Nathan immediately agreed with the plan. In 2 Samuel 7:3, the prophet said, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." It seemed like a perfect and praiseworthy idea. Who could question the desire to honor God with a glorious temple? But not all our plans, even the noblest ones, align with God's plans. That very night, God spoke to Nathan and revealed that he had something different in mind. The divine response began with a deep question in 2 Samuel 7:5. "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in?" God reminded Nathan that he had never asked for a temple. In 2 Samuel 7:6, he said, "I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling." God had walked with his people for centuries without needing a fixed temple. Furthermore, God had never complained to any of Israel's leaders about this. In 2 Samuel 7:7, he added, "Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, 'Why? Have you not built me a house of cedar?'" The message was clear. David would not build a temple for God. This was not God's plan for him. The desire was noble. The intention was pure. But the time had not yet come. God had a different purpose for David and a different plan for the temple. Even though God said no to David's desire to build the temple, he had something far greater to offer. Through the prophet Nathan, God made one of the most important promises in the entire Bible, the Davidic covenant, which would change the course of history forever. God began by reminding David of everything he had already done for him. In 2 Samuel 7:8 we read, "Now then tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel." David had been just a simple shepherd, but God made him king. God also reaffirmed his constant presence in David's life. In 2 Samuel 7-9, he said, "I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth." From facing Goliath to battling the Philistines, God had always been with David. Then God spoke about Israel's future in 2 Samuel 7:10. All the rest of the Israelites were also of one mind to make David king. It was an extraordinary display of national unity. The celebration lasted 3 days with an abundance of food and drink, as their relatives had provided ample supplies. Verse 40 says, "Also their neighbors from as far away as Issachar, Zebulun, and Naphtali came bringing food on donkeys, camels, mules, and oxen. There were plentiful supplies of flour, fig cakes, raisin cakes, wine, olive oil, cattle, and sheep." 4. There was joy in Israel. David was now not only the king of Judah, but the monarch of a united and strong nation. The little shepherd from Bethlehem, the youngest among his brothers, ascended to the throne of Israel, just as God had promised many years earlier through the prophet Samuel. His patience and faithfulness were rewarded. David did not seize the kingdom by force. Instead, he waited for God to fulfill his word at the appointed time. With the nation unified under his leadership, David knew he needed a new capital. Hebron was too far south within the territory of Judah, and it might give the impression that he was favoring his own tribe. A new city, neutral and strategic, would ideally symbolize the unity of the 12 tribes. David chose Jerusalem, then known as Jebus, inhabited by the Jebusites. The location was ideal, positioned on the border between the northern and southern tribes with excellent natural defenses and access to trade routes. In 2 Samuel 5-6 we read, "The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites felt secure behind their walls. They mocked David with arrogant defiance. In that same verse, they said to David, 'You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off.' They believed their defenses were so strong that even the disabled could defend the city. But David had a plan. In verse 8, David said, "Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies." Some scholars believe David and his men infiltrated the city through an underground water tunnel, catching the defenders off guard. Joab, David's nephew and commander of his army, led the assault and was the first to enter the city. In 1 Chronicles 11-6 we read, David had said, "Whoever leads the attack on the Jebusites will become commander-in-chief." Joab son of Zeruiah went up first, and so he became commander. The conquest of Jerusalem was a major milestone in 2 Samuel 5-7. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. He took residence in the stronghold and expanded the city inward from the terraces and the walls. This marked the birth of the city of David. David prospered because the Lord, the God of armies, was with him. Verse 10 tells us, "And David became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him." The new capital needed palaces and buildings worthy of its significance. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with carpenters, masons, and cedar logs. They built a palace for David as recorded in verse 11. Once established in Jerusalem, David took more concubines and wives and had more sons and daughters as mentioned in verse 13. Among the children born in Jerusalem were Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Iba, Elishua, Neph, Japhia, Elishama, Eliad, and Aleph listed in verses 14-16. By making Jerusalem the capital, David not only created a political center for the unified kingdom, but also laid the foundation for what would become the spiritual heart of Israel. Soon he would bring the Ark of the Covenant into the city, further solidifying Jerusalem as the nation's religious center. This visionary act by David had lasting consequences. Jerusalem would remain Israel's capital for centuries and eventually become the holiest city in Judaism and later a sacred city for both Christianity and Islam. The little shepherd boy from Bethlehem had chosen the place that would become the center of worship for the God of Israel and a symbol recognized across the world. David's rise to the throne of all Israel and the conquest of Jerusalem alarmed Israel's enemies, especially the Philistines. For years they had dominated the region, but now they saw a united Israel under a strong leader. They knew they had to act swiftly to prevent David's power from solidifying. In 2 Samuel 5:17, we read, "When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him. But David heard about it and went down to the stronghold." The Philistines positioned themselves strategically in the valley of Rephaim, southwest of Jerusalem, preparing to strike. As always, David sought God's guidance before acting. In verse 19, he asked, "Shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands?" The Lord answered, "Go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands." Confident in the Lord's word, David attacked the Philistines at Baal-perazim and defeated them. In verse 20, he declares, "As waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me." So that place was named Baal-perazim, meaning the Lord of breakthroughs, or the Lord who bursts forth. The Philistines fled in such haste that they left their idols behind on the battlefield. David and his men gathered and burned them in accordance with the law of Moses as recorded in verse 21 and complemented by 1 Chronicles 14:12. But the Philistines didn't give up easily. They returned and once again positioned themselves in the valley of Rephaim, as seen in verse 22. Once again David consulted the Lord, and this time the strategy was different. In verse 23, God instructed, "Do not go straight up but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the poplar trees." God also gave David a sign. "As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army." David followed God's instructions to the letter. In verse 25 we read, "So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Giza." This decisive victory broke the power of the Philistines who had tormented Israel for so long. David drove Israel's enemies out of the land and established peace. In 1 Chronicles 18:17, which summarizes David's military achievements, we read, "The fame of David spread throughout every land, and the Lord made all the nations fear him." News of David's power and victory spread across the region. In 1 Chronicles 14:11, it says, "The fame of David spread throughout every nation, and the Lord made all the nations fear him." With the Philistines defeated and neighboring nations respecting his strength, David solidified his position as king of Israel. The kingdom was united, had a new capital, and its traditional enemies had been subdued. This marked the beginning of Israel's golden era, a time of peace and prosperity ushered in by David's leadership. With Jerusalem established as the capital and the Philistines defeated, David turned his attention to something deeply significant: bringing the Ark of the Covenant to his new city. The Ark was Israel's most sacred symbol, the very place where God manifested his presence. For many years, it had been forgotten, left far from the center of national life. In 2 Samuel 6:1, we see how David mobilized a large group for this important mission. David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 1,000. It was a solemn and joyful moment. The king didn't want to do it alone. The entire nation needed to take part in this special occasion. The ark was in Baal, Judah, also known as Kirth Jearim. In 2 Samuel 6:2, we read, "He and all his men went to Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who's enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. This verse reminds us how special the ark truly was. It carried the very name of the Lord. To transport the ark, they prepared a new cart. According to 2 Samuel 6:3, they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzziah, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart. It was a festive procession filled with music. In 2 Samuel 6:5, we see the people's enthusiasm. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sirens, and cymbals. The joy was contagious. Picture the scene. Thousands of people singing, dancing, playing instruments, walking alongside the ark as it made its way to Jerusalem. Music echoed through the hills. King David himself was among them, not as a distant monarch, but as a passionate worshiper, rejoicing with his people. David welcomed Abner and his 20 men with a feast. The general then pledged his commitment. In verse 21, he says, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may rule over all that your heart desires." David sent him away in peace, but that peace wouldn't last. Joab, who had been away on a military expedition, returned with much plunder. When he heard that David had received Abner and let him leave peacefully, he was outraged. In verses 24 and 25, Joab confronts David. "What have you done? Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he's gone. You know Abner, son of En. He came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you are doing." Without David's knowledge, Joab secretly sent messengers after Abner, bringing him back. In Hebron, Joab took him aside at the city gate as if to speak with him privately. There, avenging the blood of his brother Asahel, he struck Abner in the stomach and killed him. This is recorded in verse 27. When David learned of the murder, he publicly declared his innocence. In verse 28, he proclaims, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of En." He cursed Joab's house and commanded that all mourn for Abner. The king himself followed the coffin and wept at Abner's tomb. All the people wept as well. In his lament, verses 33 and 34, David said, "Should Abner have died as the lawless die? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before the wicked." This public act deeply moved the people. In verse 34, it says, "All the people wept over him again." David's sincerity and mourning convinced everyone that he had no part in Abner's death. Verse 37 states, "On that day, all the people and all Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of En." David confided in his servants in verses 38 and 39. "Don't you realize that a great commander and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." Abner's assassination delayed the unification of the kingdom, but didn't prevent it. The death of the general who had once upheld Ishbosheth's throne would eventually speed up the process that led all the tribes to recognize David as king. When the news of Abner's death reached Ishbosheth, his world collapsed. Chapter 4 verse 1 describes his reaction. When Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage and all Israel became alarmed. Without Abner, his key defender and right-hand man, Ishbosheth was left exposed. He was a king in name only. His rule depended on Abner's strength and leadership. Now without that protection, it was only a matter of time before his reign came to an end. Among Ishbosheth's followers were two brothers, Bara and Rechab, sons of Rimmon from Beeroth of the tribe of Benjamin. They were commanders of raiding bands in service to Saul's son. Verse 2 of chapter 4 explains, Beer is considered part of Benjamin, because the people of Beerah fled to Gittim and have resided there as foreigners to this day. The brothers saw Ishbosheth's weakness as an opportunity to switch sides. Maybe they thought that by removing the last obstacle to David's reign, they'd earn his favor. They carefully plotted the king's assassination. In verse 5 of chapter 4, we read, Now Rab and Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerite, set out for the house of Ishbath. They arrived there in the heat of the day while he was taking his noonday rest. It was the perfect moment. The guards would be lax during the midday rest. Verse 6 of 2 Samuel 4 continues the narrative. They went into the house as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. The assassins were trusted individuals with unrestricted access to the palace. This made the crime all the more treacherous. After killing Ishbosheth, the brothers cut off his head and fled quickly. In verse 7, the text describes they had gone into the house while he was lying on his bed in his bedroom. After they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head. Taking it with them, they traveled all night by way of the Arab. Upon reaching Hebron, Reshab and Bar presented themselves to David, bringing Ishbosheth's head as a trophy. They were hoping for a generous reward for eliminating what they saw as David's last rival. In verse 8, they declare, Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. Today, the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his descendants. David's reaction, however, was far from what the assassins expected. Rather than expressing gratitude, David responded with horror and outrage at what they had done. In verses 9 to 11, David says, As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me, Saul is dead, thinking he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed? Should I not now demand his blood from your hands and rid the earth of you? Without hesitation, David ordered his young men to execute Reb and Baanah. Verse 12 tells us, So David gave an order to his men, and they killed them. They cut off their hands and feet and hung the bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. This act of justice sent a clear message to all of Israel. David did not condone betrayal or murder, even when it seemingly worked in his political favor. He refused to seize the throne through violence or scheming. He was waiting on God's timing. With Ishbosheth's death, there were no more sons of Saul laying claim to the throne, except for Mephibosheth, Jonathan's crippled son, who posed no political threat. The way was now clear for the unification of the kingdom under David's leadership. All the tribes of Israel recognized that David was the leader God had chosen. In verse 1 of 2 Samuel 5, we read, All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, We are your own flesh and blood. They acknowledged the role David had already played, even when Saul was king. Verse 2 says, In the past, while Saul was king over us, it was you who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler. So in the presence of the Lord and before the elders of Israel, David made a covenant with them at Hebron. In verse 3, it says, When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. The long-awaited dream of the United Kingdom was now fulfilled. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he ruled for 40 years. Verse 4 confirms David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. The unification marked a pivotal moment in Israel's history. After years of division and civil strife, all 12 tribes were now united under a single divinely appointed king. It was the end of uncertainty and the beginning of a new chapter for the nation. The anointing ceremony of David as king over all Israel was a moment of great national celebration. Representatives from every tribe gathered in Hebron, confirming that the entire nation recognized David's leadership. In the book of 1 Chronicles, which supplements the account in 2 Samuel, we find striking details about this historic event. In 1 Chronicles 12, E's 23-37, we read the numbers of warriors who came to Hebron to transfer the kingdom from Saul to David. From the tribe of Judah, 6,800 men armed with shields and spears. From Simeon, 7,100 brave warriors. From Levi, 4,600, in addition to Joiada, leader of Aaron's descendants with 3,700 men, and Zadok, a young warrior with 22 officers from his family, from Benjamin, Saul's own tribe, 3,000 men, most of whom had remained loyal to Saul's house until then. From Ephraim, 20th, and 800 brave warriors. From the half-tribe of Manasseh, 18,000. From Issachar, 200 chiefs with all their relatives under their command. These were men who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. From Zebulun, 50,000 experienced soldiers prepared for battle with every kind of weapon. From Naphtali, 1,000 officers and 37,000 men with shields and spears. From Dan, 2,600 men ready for battle. From Asher, 40,000 experienced warriors. And from the tribes east of the Jordan, Reuben, Gad, and the other half of Manasseh, 120,000. Men armed with all kinds of weapons. In verse 38, we read, "All these were fighting men who volunteered to serve in the ranks. They came to Hebron, fully determined to make David king over all Israel." In verse 14 of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, he said to Joab, "Let the young men come forward and compete before us." Joab agreed. What was supposed to be a display of skill turned into tragedy. 12 young men from each side entered the contest, but no one backed down. In verse 16 of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, we read, "Each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they fell down together." Instead of settling the dispute, that place later called Helkath Hazerim, field of sharp swords, ignited the spark of civil war. The confrontation quickly escalated into full-blown battle. In verse 17 of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, we are told the battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the Israelites were defeated by David's men. Among David's men were his 3 nephews, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, the latter known for his speed. Verse 18 says, "Asahel was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle, chose to personally chase down Abner. Asahel ran straight after Abner, not turning to the right or the left. The seasoned general realized who was pursuing him and tried to deter him." In verse 20 of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, Abner asks, "Is that you, Asahel?" To which he replied, "It is." Not wanting to kill Joab's brother and further deepen the blood feud, Abner warned him twice, "Stop chasing me. Take on one of the young men and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel refused to stop. With regret, Abner gave one final warning in verse 22, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look your brother Joab in the face?" Still, the young man paid no heed. Seeing no other choice, Abner struck Asahel with the blunt end of his spear, driving it through his stomach so forcefully that it came out his back. Verse 23 of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel reads, "Asahel fell there and died on the spot, and everyone who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stopped and stood still." Asahel's death only fueled the pursuit. Joab and Abishai continued to chase Abner until sunset, reaching the hill of Ammah near Giah on the way to the wilderness of Gibeon. The men of Benjamin, Saul's tribe, regrouped around Abner at the top of the hill, forming a unified force. From there, Abner called out to Joab in verse 26 of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness?" How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites?" Joab replied in verse 27, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued pursuing their fellow Israelites until morning." He then sounded the trumpet, and his troops ceased their pursuit. Abner and his men marched through the night by way of the Arabah, crossed the Jordan, and walked all morning until they reached Mahanaim. Joab returned from chasing Abner and gathered his troops. 19 men were missing in addition to Asahel. Meanwhile, David's men had struck down 360 Benjaminites, followers of Abner. The civil war was just beginning and would last a long time. In verse 1 of chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, we read, "The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker." As the war dragged on, loyalties began to shift. In the same verse, we again read, "David became increasingly powerful while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker." Amid this conflict, internal tensions began to arise within Ishbosheth's kingdom. The breaking point came when Ishbosheth accused Abner of sleeping with Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, one of Saul's concubines. In that culture, such an act could be interpreted as a claim to the throne. In verse 7 of chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, Ishbosheth asks, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" Abner was furious at the accusation. After all, he had been the main supporter of Ishbosheth, preserving what was left of Saul's kingdom. In verse 8 of chapter 3 in 2 Samuel, he responds, "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day, I am loyal to the house of your father Saul and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David, yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman." That was the last straw. Abner made a solemn oath. In verses 9 and 10 of chapter 3, he declares, "May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." Ishbosheth was so frightened that he couldn't say a word in response. The general then sent messengers to David proposing a treaty. In verse 12 he says, "Whose land is it anyway? Make a covenant with me, and I will help bring all Israel over to you." David agreed to negotiate, but set a condition. In verse 13, he replies, "Good, I will make a covenant with you. But one thing I demand, do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see me." Michal was David's first wife, whom Saul had given to another man when David fled. Meanwhile, David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, formally demanding Michal's return. Saul's son complied and had her taken from her current husband Peliel. The scene was heartbreaking. In verse 16 we read, "Her husband went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, 'Go back home.' So he went back. At the same time, Abner was working to win over Israel's leaders. In verses 17 and 18, he argues, "For some time you have wanted to make David your king. Now do it. For the Lord promised David, 'By my servant David, I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from all their enemies.'" He spoke especially to the Benjamites, Saul's tribe, then went to Hebron to tell David that all Israel was ready to accept him as king. He promised, "And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning." It was a promise of national stability and security that would bring great comfort to the people. But the most astonishing part of the promise was yet to come. Instead of David building a house for God, it would be God who would build a house, a dynasty for David. In 2 Samuel 7:11, God declared, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you." The word house here doesn't mean a building. It refers to a royal lineage that would continue for generations. God detailed this promise in the verses that follow. In 2 Samuel 7:12, he says, "When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom." This promise would be fulfilled first through Solomon, David's son. Then God revealed who would build the temple. In 2 Samuel 7:13, he promises, "He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." Solomon would receive the honor, denied to David. He would build the temple for the Lord. God's relationship with David's descendant would be unique. In 2 Samuel 7:14, he declares, "I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands." God would establish a father-son relationship with David's heir, marked by both love and necessary discipline. But the most remarkable part of the promise comes in 2 Samuel 7:16. "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." This was no temporary or conditional promise. It was eternal. David's lineage would never be completely cut off. This promise points beyond Solomon, beyond all the human kings that would come after. In its fullest sense, it points to Jesus Christ, the ultimate Son of David, whose kingdom will truly have no end. The Davidic covenant is one of the foundational pillars of God's plan of salvation, linking David's temporal reign to the eternal reign of the Messiah. David was deeply moved by this incredible promise. In 2 Samuel 7:18, we see his humble response. "Then King David went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, 'Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far?'" The great king saw himself as small in the face of God's greatness and his promises. With God's blessing firmly established over his reign, David turned his focus to securing Israel. Though he had already defeated the Philistines, other enemies still threatened the nation's borders. It was time to establish peace through decisive victories. In 2 Samuel 801, we read of the first of these major conquests. In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheghamar from the control of the Philistines. This victory secured control over an important Philistine center, significantly reducing the threat from the west. David then turned his attention eastward to the Moabites. In 2 Samuel 8-2, we read of their defeat. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. This tactic may seem harsh to us today, but it was common in ancient warfare. David didn't wipe out Moab entirely, but established dominance over them, ensuring they would no longer threaten Israel. To the north, David faced another powerful enemy. In 2 Samuel 8-3, we read, "Moreover, David defeated Hadader, son of Rehab, king of Zah, when he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River." Hadader was a powerful king who controlled vast region north of Israel. This victory greatly expanded David's influence in the area. The battle against Hadazer was intense. David captured many soldiers and horses. In 2 Samuel 8-4, we see the scale of this win. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 feet soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. Hamstring the horses ensured they couldn't be used in future attacks against Israel. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadader, David defeated them as well. In 2 Samuel 8-5, we read, "When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Adar, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them." This was a decisive victory over a considerable force. These triumphs allowed David to establish military outposts in strategic territories. In 2 Samuel 8-6, the text says, "He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went." From these battles, David brought many treasures. Back to Jerusalem. In 2 Samuel 8-7 we read, "David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadassah and brought them to Jerusalem." And verse 8 continues, "From Tebah and Berthi, towns that belonged to Hadassah, King David took a great quantity of bronze." David's victories impressed other kings in the region. In 2 Samuel 8-9, we see one such response. When Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle, because Hadza had been at war with Toi. Joram didn't come empty-handed. In 2 Samuel 8:10, we read about the gifts he brought. Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. These were diplomatic offerings, signaling Toi's desire to maintain good relations with Israel's powerful king. David didn't keep these riches for himself. In 2 Samuel 8:11, we see what he did with them. King David dedicated these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued. This reveals David's heart. He saw his victories as gifts from God and gave back a portion of the spoilers and the David had. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. The victory over Edom was especially decisive. In 2 Samuel 8:13, we read, "And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 in the valley of Salt." This battle secured Israelite control over the crucial southern region. As in other conquered territories, David stationed troops in Edom. In 2 Samuel 8:14, the text says, "He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all that became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went." David's military victories weren't just for defense. They enabled Israel to significantly expand its territory, transforming it into a true regional empire. This expansion fulfilled God's ancient promises regarding the land he would give to his chosen people. When God made his covenant with Abraham, in Genesis 15:18, he promised on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants, I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." This ambitious promise was now beginning to take shape under David's reign. Following his victories, David's territory stretched from the Wadi of Egypt, likely Wadi al-Arish in the northern Sinai Peninsula, all the way to near the Euphrates River in the north. Never before had Israel controlled such a vast area to the west. The defeat of the Philistines allowed Israel to finally take full control of the coastal plain. This was a fertile and strategic region that had never been fully subdued since the conquest of Canaan. To the south, victory over the gave Israel control over key trade routes passing through Edom, including access to the Red Sea via the port of Etzion-Gba, later mentioned during Solomon's reign. This opened new commercial opportunities, allowing Israel to engage in maritime trade with distant places like Ophir. To the east, the subjugation of Moab and Ammon ensured that these long-standing threats would no longer disturb the Israelite tribes living in the Transjordan. The entire region from the Jordan River to the desert was now under Israel's control. To the north, victories over Zobah and the Arameans of Damascus extended Israel's influence deep into Syria. In 2 Samuel 10:19, we read how this campaign concluded when all the kings who were vassals of Hadassah saw that they had been defeated by Israel. They made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. So the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. This territorial expansion brought great benefits to Israel. Curiosity soon turned into desire. He had to know who she was. In 2 Samuel 11:3 we read, David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The information was clear and direct. Bathsheba was not single. She was married to Uriah, one of David's most valiant warriors, who at that very moment was risking his life in the war against the Ammonites. That should have ended it. But the desire had already taken root in David's heart. David sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to him. When she arrived at the palace, he could no longer claim ignorance about her situation. He knew she was married. He knew her husband was at war, serving the kingdom faithfully. But at that moment, desire outweighed conscience. In 2 Samuel 11-4, the narrative is blunt. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The text notes that Bathsheba had just purified herself after her menstrual period, an important detail that confirms she wasn't pregnant before the encounter. And this brief meeting, which may have lasted just a few hours, would forever change both of their lives. What David may have thought was a momentary lapse, a mistake that would stay hidden forever, quickly turned into something far more complicated. In 2 Samuel 11-5, we read the immediate consequence. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I am pregnant." The message was short, just 3 words, but its impact was massive. David now faced a serious problem. Bathsheba was pregnant, and her husband Uriah had been away at war for months too long to be the father. Once her pregnancy became visible, everyone would know she had been unfaithful. In the ancient world, that could mean death by stoning. Moreover, if the truth were to come out, David's reputation as a just and God-fearing king would be ruined. The man chosen by God, the man after God's own heart, had committed adultery with the wife of one of his most loyal soldiers. The situation called for a swift solution, and David began to devise a plan to cover up his sin. David knew he had to act quickly. If Uriah stayed away any longer, it would be impossible to hide the fact that the child wasn't his. The solution seemed simple: bring Uriah back to Jerusalem for a few days. If he spent time with his wife, everyone would later assume the baby was his. In 2 Samuel 11-6, we see the first step of this plan. So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah arrived, David welcomed him like a concerned king checking in on his troops. In 2 Samuel 11-7 it says, when Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. This conversation was merely a smokescreen to hide David's true intentions. After the small talk about the war, David offered Uriah what seemed like a generous gift. In 2 Samuel 11-8, it says, "Then David said to Uriah, 'Go down to your house and wash your feet.' So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Uriah had been dismissed to go home and spend time with his wife. David even sent a gift after him, likely food and wine to set the mood. The plan seemed flawless, but there was something David hadn't accounted for: Uriah's extraordinary sense of duty and loyalty. In 2 Samuel 11-9, we see what happened. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. This completely caught David off guard when he heard what happened in 2 Samuel 11:10. He asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah's response reveals his noble and loyal character. In 2 Samuel 11:11, he says, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." These words must have pierced David's heart like arrows. While Uriah refused even the comforts of his own home out of loyalty to his fellow soldiers, David had taken this man's wife. The contrast between the two men's character couldn't be more stark. Still, David was determined to carry out his plan. In 2 Samuel 11:12, he tried again. "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. David now switched tactics. In 2 Samuel 11:13, we read, "At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home." The dead plan had completely failed. Even in a drunken state, Uriah's integrity remained unshaken. He would not go home while his comrades were still on the battlefield. David's attempt to cover up his sin was falling apart, and time was running out. Lastly, all his efforts to get Uriah home having failed, David made a terrible decision. If he couldn't cover up the adultery, he would eliminate the only man who could expose it. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was cold and calculated. In 2 Samuel 11:14, we see the next move. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it. With Uriah, the contents of the letter reveal how far David had fallen morally. In 2 Samuel 11:15, we read, "In it," he wrote, "put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." Imagine the scene. Uriah, the loyal and honorable soldier, unknowingly carrying his own death warrant. He trusted his king so deeply that he didn't even think to open the letter. The man who had refused to enjoy the comfort of home while others fought, now carried without knowing the orders for his own assassination. Joab, the army commander, received the letter and followed David's orders. In 2 Samuel 11:16, we see how the plan was carried out. So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. The opportunity came during an attack on the city of Rabbah. In 2 Samuel 11:17, we read the result. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. The plan had worked. Uriah was dead along with other Israelite soldiers. To everyone else, it looked like a typical wartime casualty. Joab sent a report of the battle to David, including the news of Uriah's death. In 2 Samuel 11:18-21, Joab even prepped the messenger, knowing David might pretend to be upset about how close they got to the wall. When the messenger reached Jerusalem, he reported the events just as Joab had instructed. In 2 Samuel 11:24, he concluded, "Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah, the Hittite, is dead." David's response reveals his hypocrisy. In 2 Samuel 11:25, he says, "Say this to Joab, don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it." Say this to encourage Joab. These words show just how far David had fallen. He spoke of Uriah's death casually, as though it were just another wartime loss. The same king who once mourned deeply for Saul and Jonathan, who even executed a man for claiming to have killed Saul, was now coldly indifferent to a death he had orchestrated. With Uriah dead, David quickly took Bathsheba as his wife. In 2 Samuel 11:26 we read, "When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him." After a brief period of mourning in verse 27, David had her brought to his house and she became his wife and bore him a son. 2. The public eye, everything seemed perfectly legitimate. A war widow had married the king, a story some might even view as romantic. The sin appeared to be covered up. David may have thought he had gotten away with it, that his plan had worked flawlessly. But the final verse of 2 Samuel 11 brings a somber conclusion to the entire affair. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. David may have deceived his people. He may have even tried to deceive himself. But there was no deceiving God. And soon David would face the consequences of his actions. For almost a year, David lived as if everything were normal. He had married Bathsheba. Their child had been born, and no one questioned the legitimacy of the boy. Life went on in the royal palace. But God saw everything, and he sent the prophet Nathan to confront the king. In 2 Samuel 12:1, we read, "The Lord sent Nathan to David." Instead of accusing the king directly, Nathan used a clever strategy. Trade routes previously controlled by hostile nations were now in Israel's hands, generating wealth through tolls and tribute. The natural resources of a much larger land now supported God's people. The conquered peoples became Israel's servants, or vassals, paying regular tribute that filled the treasury in Jerusalem. In 2 Samuel 8:2, we're told that the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. The same is noted for the Arameans in verse 6 and for the in verse 14. This expansion also ushered in an unprecedented era of peace, with traditional enemies defeated or turned into vassals. Israel could finally enjoy a period of stability. Tribes that had long lived under the constant threat of foreign invasion now experienced security and prosperity. To maintain this vast territory, David established military garrisons at strategic locations. In 2 Samuel 8-6, we read that he put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and in verse 14 that he put garrisons throughout Edom. These served both to defend Israel's borders and to ensure that the conquered peoples continued paying tribute. The empire David built became one of the dominant powers in the ancient Near East. Under his leadership, Israel transformed from a loose tribal confederation into a respected and feared kingdom. In 2 Samuel 5:10, we find the key to this success. And David became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. This expansion wasn't merely a matter of military conquest. It was the fulfillment of God's divine plan. He had promised this land to Israel. And through David, that promise was being realized on a scale never seen before. The boundaries envisioned in the days of Joshua were now being secured and even surpassed. The neighboring nations that once mocked and attacked Israel now feared and respected it. Instead of being invaded, Israel was now influencing those around it. Instead of paying tribute to foreign oppressors, Israel was receiving it. The transformation was complete. The impact of this expansion would be felt for generations. The territory secured by David would form the foundation for Solomon's even more prosperous kingdom. The peace achieved through these victories would enable the construction of the temple and the flourishing of Israelite culture and trade. David had transformed Israel from a loosely knit group of tribes into a unified kingdom and then into a true empire. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of carefully planned and executed military campaigns. David's success can be measured not only by the land he conquered, but by the stability he brought. The subjugated nations remained loyal vassals throughout his reign, allowing Israel to enjoy a period of peace and prosperity unparalleled in its history. Across the empire, David's authority was recognized and respected. His fame spread far beyond Israel's borders. In 2 Samuel 7-9, God had promised David, "Now I will make your name great like the names of the greatest men on earth." That promise was now being fulfilled. As David's name became known and honored throughout the ancient Near East with a growing empire, David needed efficient administration. He established a strong central government, appointing officials to oversee different areas. In 2 Samuel 8:15, we see his priority. David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. To help him in this task, David appointed capable men to key positions. In 2 Samuel 8:16, we're told Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Joab, David's nephew, was his chief general, while Jehoshaphat was responsible for maintaining the kingdom's official records. Verse 17 continues, Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimsh, son of Abiathar, were priests. Seraiah was secretary. There were 2 chief priests, possibly representing different priestly families. Seraiah served as royal scribe, responsible for the kingdoms, correspondence, and documentation. Verse 18 completes the list of key officials. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kathites and Pelethites, and David's sons were royal advisors. The Kathites and Pelethites formed David's personal guard, an elite military force. The king's own sons served as royal counselors or special ministers. In 1 Chronicles chapter 27, we find additional details about David's military organization. He divided the army into 12 divisions, 1 for each month of the year. In verse 1, we read, "This is the list of the Israelites, heads of families, commanders of thousands and of hundreds, and other officers who served the king in all matters concerning the divisions that rotated monthly in and out of service. Each division consisted of 24,000 men. This rotation system was brilliant. It meant Israel always had a standing military force of 24,000 men ready, but also that soldiers could spend most of the year at home, tending to their families and land. Each man only served 1 month per year, minimizing the economic impact of military service." The following verses list the commanders of each monthly division, starting with Jashabim in the first month, Dodai in the second, and so on. These were brave men, battle-hardened, and capable of leading large groups of soldiers. In addition to these regular divisions, David maintained a permanent elite force of warriors known as David's mighty men. In 2 Samuel chapter 23, we find a list of these special heroes and their remarkable feats. Verse 8 mentions Joshbasht, who raised his spear against 800 men whom he killed in a single encounter. David also organized the tribes under specific leaders. In 1 Chronicles 27, starting from verse 16, we find a list of tribal leaders. These were the leaders of the tribes of Israel over the Reubenites, Elazar son of Zikri over the Simeonites, Shapashah son of Makkah, and so on. For each tribe to manage the royal properties and resources, David appointed special administrators. In verse 25 of 1 Chronicles 27, we read, "Ozma, son of Adil, was in charge of the royal storehouses. Others were in charge of farms, vineyards, olive groves, livestock, and royal plantations, as detailed in the following verses." David's personal council included wise and experienced men. In 1 Chronicles 27-32, we read, "Jonathan, David's uncle, was a counselor, a man of insight, and a scribe. Jehiel, son of Hakana, took care of the king's sons." Jonathan was likely not the same Jonathan, son of Saul and David's close friend, who had already died, but rather another relative with the same name. David's administration even included a taxation system. In 2 Samuel 20:24, we read, "Adonam was in charge of forced labor." This official likely oversaw the Corv system, where citizens worked on public projects for specific periods. This complex administrative system enabled David to effectively govern a vast and diverse territory. Israel was no longer just a loose confederation of tribes. It had become a centralized kingdom with established institutions. The system David created would serve as a model for future kings of Israel and Judah. The combination of strong military leadership, efficient administration, and justice for the people made David's reign Israel's golden age. As stated in 2 Samuel 8:15, David reigned over all Israel, administering justice and righteousness to all his people. This was David's administrative legacy, a government that not only conquered, but ruled with wisdom and justice. Spring had come once again to Jerusalem. It was the season when kings typically went out to war. The army of Israel was in the field fighting the Ammonites under Joab's command. But this time, something was different. David, the warrior king who always led his troops into battle, had stayed behind. In 2 Samuel 11:1, we find this crucial detail. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army to destroy the Ammonites and besiege Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. This seemingly small decision would change everything. A king who should have been on the battlefield with his men was at home idle without the responsibilities that usually filled his days. And as often happens, that idleness opened the door to temptation. On a warm afternoon, after resting, David got up and took a walk on the palace rooftop. From there, he could see the rooftops and courtyards of the surrounding houses. In 2 Samuel 11-2, we read, "One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. The woman was extraordinarily beautiful. Instead of looking away, David kept watching. Then he went to his own house, and at his request, they served him food and he ate. The servants couldn't understand this change in behavior. In 2 Samuel 12:21, they asked, 'Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat.' David's response reveals a deep understanding of God's sovereignty and an acceptance of his will. In verses 22 and 23, he explains, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." These words reflect a mature and grounded faith. David had done everything he could while there was still hope, pleading for divine mercy. But once God's will became clear, he accepted it with dignity and submission. There was no bitterness or rebellion in his heart, only a humble acceptance of God's judgment. After the death of their first son, David comforted his wife Bathsheba in their shared grief. In 2 Samuel 12:24, we read, "Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and lay with her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon." The name Solomon comes from the Hebrew word shalom, meaning peace. Perhaps David and Bathsheba hoped that this child would bring peace after the pain and turmoil they had endured. But something even more special happened with this child. In the same verse, it says, "The Lord loved him." This wasn't just a passing remark. God's favor on Solomon was so evident that the Lord sent the prophet Nathan again, this time with a very different message. In 2 Samuel 12:25, we read, "And because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedidiah." The name Jedidiah means loved by the Lord. It was a clear sign that despite the sins of his parents, this child was especially loved and chosen by God. The same prophet who had once brought a message of judgment now came bearing a message of blessing and promise. Although the Bible doesn't describe much about Solomon's childhood, we know he grew up with God's special favor. Later, David would choose Solomon as his successor, bypassing older sons like Adonijah, who would have had the natural right to the throne. In 1 Chronicles 28-5, David explains why he chose Solomon. "Of all my sons, and the Lord has given me many, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel." And in verse 6, David continues, revealing God's promise. "He said to me, Solomon, your son is the one who will build my house and my courts. For I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father." So even from a relationship that began with sin and tragedy, God in his sovereignty brought something good. Solomon would become the wisest and wealthiest king Israel had ever known. He would build the temple David had longed to build, and his lineage would eventually lead to Joseph, the adoptive father of Jesus Christ. But before Solomon could reign in peace, David's household would endure further tragedy, fulfilling Nathan's prophecy that the sword shall never depart from your house. The shadow of David's sin soon began to fall upon his own family. A 2 Samuel 13 tells a disturbing story that echoes the king's own moral failings, only in a more twisted way. In 2 Samuel 13:1, we read, "In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. Tamar and Absalom were the children of Maacah, one of David's wives, while Amnon was the son of Ahinoam, another wife. They were half-siblings, same father, different mothers. In that culture, the law of Moses forbade marriage between half-siblings. Amnon's infatuation grew into obsession. In 2 Samuel 13:22, it says, Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. Amnon had a cunning friend named Jonadab, who was also his cousin. In 2 Samuel 13:3 we read, Now Amnon had an advisor named Jonadab, son of Shmiha, David's brother. Jonadab was a very shrewd man. Seeing Amnon's distress, Jonadab asked what was going on. In 2 Samuel 13:4, he says, Why do you, the king's son, look so haggarded morning after morning? Won't you tell me? Amnon then confesses, I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. Instead of advising Amnon to let go of this inappropriate desire, Jonadab devised a terrible plan. In 2 Samuel 13:5, he suggests, Go to bed and pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, say to him, I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight, so I may watch her, and then eat it from her hand. Amnon followed the plan and pretended to be sick. When David came to see him, he requested that Tamar be sent to cook for him. In 2 Samuel 13:7, we read, David sent word to Tamar at the palace, Go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him. Unaware of any danger, Tamar went to her brother's house. In 2 Samuel 13:8, it says, So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight, and baked it. When the food was ready, Amnon refused to eat in front of the servants. In 2 Samuel 13:9, it says, Then she took the pan and served him the bread, but he refused to eat. Send everyone out of here, Amnon said. So everyone left him. Alone with Tamar, Amnon revealed his true intentions. In Samuel 13:10, we read, Then Amnon said to Tamar, Bring the food into my bedroom so I may eat from your hand. And Tamar took the bread she had prepared and brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. What happened next was a terrible violation. In 2 Samuel 13:11 we read, But when she brought it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, Come to bed with me, my sister. Tamar desperately tried to stop what was about to happen. In 2 Samuel 13:12, she pleaded, No, my brother, she said to him. Don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. She kept trying to dissuade him, pointing out the consequences. In 2 Samuel 13:13, Tamar said, What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you. But Amnon refused to listen to his sister's pleas. In the 2 Samuel 13:14, we read, But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. Immediately after this horrific act, Amnon's feelings changed entirely. In 2 Samuel 13:15, we see, Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, Get up and get out. Tamar protested this new cruelty. In 2 Samuel 13:16, she said, No, she said to him, Sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me. But Amnon refused to listen to her. He called his servant and gave the order as seen in 2 Samuel 13:17. "Get this woman out of here and bolt the door after her." The servant obeyed, throwing Tamar out as if she were the guilty one. The text then describes Tamar's deep grief. In 2 Samuel 13:19, we read, "Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornate robe she was wearing. She put her hands on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. Her brother Absalom found her and realized what had happened. In 2 Samuel 13:20, he said, 'Has your brother Amnon been with you? Be quiet now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart.' And Tamar, ruined and devastated, lived in Absalom's house. When David learned of what had happened, he was furious, but took no action against Amnon. In 2 Samuel 13:21, we read, "When King David heard all this, he was furious." David's inaction may have been influenced by his own guilt. How could he punish Amnon for a sin so similar to his own? His hesitation, however, would have dire consequences because Absalom neither forgot nor forgave what was done to his sister. The Shaw biblical text tells us that Absalom kept his hatred to himself. In 2 Samuel 13:22, we read, "Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad." He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. For 2 full years, Absalom waited patiently for a chance to take revenge. He didn't confront Amnon directly, nor did he speak to the king about it. But his hatred grew daily, fueled by the memory of his sister's suffering and the absence of justice. The opportunity for revenge finally came when Absalom held a sheep-shearing celebration. In 2 Samuel 13:23 we read, 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep-shearers were at Baal-Hazor near the border of Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come there. He told a parable that would stir David's sense of justice. In verses 1 to 4 of chapter 12, Nathan tells the story. There were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. The story was simple yet powerful, and David, not realizing the parable was about himself, reacted with outrage. In 2 Samuel 12:5, we read, "David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, 'As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity.'" It was at that moment Nathan pointed his finger at the king and declared the words that would strike David like a thunderbolt. In 2 Samuel 12:7, he says, "You are the man." Nathan then reminded David of all that God had done for him, how he had anointed him king, delivered him from the hands of Saul, given him his master's house and wives, and even gave him the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, God would have given him even more. Yet David had despised the word of the Lord by doing what was evil in his eyes. In 2 Samuel 12:9, Nathan clearly lays out David's sins. "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and took his wife to be your own." Then comes the judgment. In 2 Samuel 12:10, Nathan declares, "Now therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own." And the prophecy continues in verses 11 and 12. "This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I'm going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel." Confronted directly by Nathan and by the word of God, David did not try to justify his actions or deny his wrongdoing. Unlike many leaders who cling to power and refuse to admit fault, David immediately acknowledged his guilt. In 2 Samuel 12:13, we see his sincere response. Then David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." This simple and direct confession revealed David's true character. Even after committing such grievous sins, his heart was still responsive to divine truth. Nathan then replied, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die." According to the law of Moses, both adultery and murder were punishable by death. David deserved to die for his crimes, but God in his mercy spared his life. However, there would still be consequences. In 2 Samuel 12:14, Nathan explains, "But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die." God's forgiveness did not erase the natural consequences of sin. The child conceived in adultery would die, and the sword would never depart from David's household. His sins would echo through his family's life, setting off a cycle of violence and tragedy. Psalm 51, traditionally attributed to David after his encounter with Nathan, reveals the depth of his repentance. In verse 1, he cries, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion. Blot out my transgressions." And in verse 10, he pleads, "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." Soon after Nathan's departure, the child born to Bathsheba fell severely ill. In 2 Samuel 12:15, we read, "After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill." The child's sickness threw David into deep anguish. This powerful king, who had conquered nations and slain giants, now found himself utterly helpless before his son's suffering. No army could win this battle. No strategy could change the outcome. In his desperation, David turned to the only source of hope, God's mercy. In 2 Samuel 12:16, we read, "David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground." The royal advisors were concerned by his behavior. In 2 Samuel 12:17, it says the elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. For 7 days, David remained prostrate, fasting and praying for his child's life. His sorrow was so profound that his servants feared telling him when the worst had happened. In 2 Samuel 12:18, we read, "On the 7th day, the child died." David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate, the servants were whispering among themselves. But David noticed and understood what had happened. In 2 Samuel 12:19, we read, David noticed that his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. "Is the child dead?" he asked. They replied, "He is dead." David's reaction surprised everyone. In 2 Samuel 12:20, it says, "Then David got up from the ground after he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. He went into the house of the Lord and worshipped." Absalom personally invited his father to the celebration. In 2 Samuel 13:24, he said, "Your servant has had shures come. Will the king and his attendants please join me?" David declined the invitation, but Absalom insisted that at least Amnon come. In 2 Samuel 13:26, he said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." The king asked, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom pressed him until he agreed to let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Absalom's plan had been carefully set in motion. In 2 Samuel 13:28, we see his instructions to his servants. Listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave. During the feast, when everyone was eating and drinking, Absalom's servants executed the plan. In 2 Samuel 13:29, we read, So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the king's sons got up, mounted their mules, and fled. As the princes rushed back to Jerusalem, alarming news arrived before they did. In 2 Samuel 13:30, we read, While they were on their way, the report came to David, Absalom has struck down all the king's sons. Not one of them is left. David was devastated. In 2 Samuel 13:31, we read, The king stood up, tore his clothes, and lay down on the ground, and all his attendants stood by with their clothes torn. But Jonadab, the same cousin who had once helped Amnon with his vile plan, now brought more accurate news. In 2 Samuel 13:32, he said, My lord should not think that they killed all the princes. Only Amnon is dead. This has been Absalom's expressed intention ever since the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar. Soon after the king's sons arrived, crying loudly and confirmed that only Amnon had died. In 2 Samuel 13:36 we read, As they were on their way in, the report reached the king, and he too and all his servants wept very bitterly. Meanwhile, Absalom fled to Gisha, where his maternal grandfather Talmai was king. In 2 Samuel 13:37-38, we read, Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Gisha. But King David mourned many days for his son. After Absalom fled and went to Gisha, he stayed there 3 years. The text reveals David's conflicted emotions during this time. In 2 Samuel 13:37, it says, And King David mourned for his son every day. At first, this referred to Amnon, the son who had been killed. But over time, David's feelings toward Absalom began to shift. In 2 Samuel 13:39, we read, And the king longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. Despite the terrible crime Absalom had committed, David missed his son and longed for reconciliation. This series of tragedies, the violence against Tamar, the murder of Amnon, and the exile of Absalom, was the direct fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy about the consequences of David's sin. The sword will never depart from your house. David's sons were repeating and even amplifying the very sins of their father. David's adultery led to family violence, murder, and exile. The king, who had once enjoyed great success and divine favor, was now watching his own household fall apart before his eyes. And this was only the beginning of the troubles that would plague David's house. 3 long years had passed since Absalom fled to Geshur after killing his brother Amnon. During all that time, David missed his son deeply, even knowing the terrible crime he had committed. In 2 Samuel 14:1, we read how Joab sensed the king's longing. Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. Recognizing this, Joab devised a plan to bring Absalom back. He sent a wise woman from Tekoa to David with a moving story. She dressed in mourning and told the king about her 2 sons who had fought in the field. One had killed the other, and now the family wanted to kill the remaining son, leaving her with no heir. After David promised to protect her son, the woman revealed the real reason for her visit. In 2 Samuel 14:13, she asked, Why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself for not bringing back his banished son? She went on with a profound comparison. In 2 Samuel 14:14, she said, Like water spilled on the ground which cannot be recovered, so we must die. But that is not what God desires. Rather, he devises ways so that a banished person does not remain banished from him forever. These words moved David's heart. He realized Joab was behind the plan and confronted him. Then in 2 Samuel 14:21, the king decided, "Very well, I will do it. Go bring back the young man Absalom." Joab was grateful and personally went to Gishur to bring Absalom back. In 2 Samuel 14:23, we read, "Then Joab went to Gishur and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem." But Absalom's return did not mean a full reconciliation with his father. In 2 Samuel 14:24, we see the limitations David imposed. But the king said, "He must go to his own house. He must not see my face." So Absalom went to his own house and did not see the face of the king. This was a painful situation. Absalom was back in Jerusalem, but still not allowed to see his father's face. It was a partial reconciliation, leaving open wounds in their relationship. Meanwhile, the text gives us a description of Absalom. In 2 Samuel 14:25, we read, "In all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him." And in the next verse, we learn about his famous hair. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut it once a year because it became too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. Absalom had 3 sons and a daughter whom he named Tamar, likely in honor of his sister who had been assaulted. Absalom's daughter was also very beautiful, as mentioned in 2 Samuel 14:27. After living in Jerusalem for 2 years without seeing, the king Absalom grew impatient. In 2 Samuel 14:28, we read, "Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. He summoned Joab twice to act as an intermediary, but Joab refused to come. Frustrated, Absalom resorted to an extreme tactic to get Joab's attention. In 2 Samuel 14:30, we see, "Then he said to his servants, 'Look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire.' So Absalom's servant set the field on fire. This drastic move got Joab's attention, and he came at once to speak with Absalom. In 2 Samuel 14:32, Absalom expressed his frustration. "Why have I come from Gishur? It would be better for me if I was still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death." Joab delivered the message to David, who finally agreed to see his son. In 2 Samuel 14:33, we read about the meeting. So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. That kiss seemed to seal the reconciliation between father and son. But beneath the surface, unresolved emotions still lingered. Forgiveness without true relational restoration left room for resentment to grow. And Absalom, handsome and charismatic, would soon begin to turn that resentment into something far more dangerous. Even after reconciling with his father, Absalom wasn't satisfied. He wanted more than forgiveness. He wanted power. Soon after being readmitted to the royal court, Absalom began preparing to take his father's throne. In 2 Samuel 15:1, we see how he built his image. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses, and with 50 men to run ahead of him. This display of pomp was classic royal behavior, a way for Absalom to present himself as a prince worthy of admiration and respect. But his ambitions went beyond appearances. Absalom developed a strategy to win the hearts of the people. In 2 Samuel 15:2, we read, "He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him and ask, 'What town are you from?' He would answer, 'Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel.'" Absalom used these encounters to subtly undermine the people's trust in David. In 2 Samuel 15:3, his tactic becomes clear. Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear. He was suggesting that David's administration was no longer functioning effectively, that the people were not being heard or receiving the justice they deserved. Absalom then positioned himself as the solution. In 2 Samuel 15-4, he said, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they received justice." When people came to pay homage to Absalom, he displayed a false humility. In 2 Samuel 15-5 we read, "Also, whenever someone approached to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him." This behavior painted a picture of an approachable, friendly prince. Quite the contrast. To the more distant and majestic figure of David, this strategy worked perfectly. In 2 Samuel 15-6, we see the result. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king to seek justice. And so, he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. For 4 years, Absalom worked patiently building his support base throughout Israel. Then in 2 Samuel 15-7, he made his move. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord." David, suspecting nothing, granted permission for his son to go. In verse 9 we read, "The king said to him, 'Go in peace.' So he went to Hebron. But this trip was not about fulfilling a religious vow. It marked the beginning of open rebellion against David. In 2 Samuel 15-10, we see the real plan. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say Absalom is king in Hebron." Absalom had chosen Hebron strategically. It was where David had first been anointed king, rich with historical and emotional meaning for the people. It was also far enough from Jerusalem to allow Absalom to establish his base before David could respond. To further strengthen his position, Absalom invited 200 influential men from Jerusalem to accompany him. In 2 Samuel 15-11, we read 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. Absalom also secured the support of Ahil, one of David's most trusted advisors. In verse 12, it says, "While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahil the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown." And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. This was a devastating blow to David. Ahil was renowned for his exceptional wisdom. In 2 Samuel 16:23 we read, "Now in those days the advice Ahil gave was like that of one who inquires of God." That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahil's advice. The conspiracy was spreading rapidly. In 2 Samuel 15:13, news finally reached David. A messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom." Absalom's plan had worked flawlessly. Over the years he had won the people's loyalty through his impressive appearance, friendly demeanor, and promises of a better rule. Now with public support and Ahil's counsel, he was ready to take the kingdom from his father. When news of Absalom's rebellion arrived, David immediately grasped the seriousness of the situation. He knew there was no time to waste. In Samuel 15:14, he makes a decisive move. Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." This was a shocking decision. David, the mighty warrior who had conquered Jerusalem and defeated countless enemies, now chose to flee from his own city rather than defend it. It showed both the strength of the rebellion and David's deep reluctance to fight his own son. David's officials remained loyal. In verse 15, they responded, "Your servants are ready to do whatever our lord the king chooses." In the moving scene, we see David leaving Jerusalem like a refugee. In verse 16, it says, "The king set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace." The passage paints a vivid image of this sorrowful procession. In verse 17, "So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at the edge of the city. From there, David watched as his servants and guards passed before him. Among those loyal to David were the Kirthites and Pelethites, his elite troops, and 600 men from Gath, who had followed him since his exile. They were led by Iti, the Gittite, who showed remarkable loyalty. David tried to release Ittai and his men from any obligation to follow him. In verse 19, he says, "Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with the new king, since you are a foreigner and an exile from your homeland." David's words show his uncertainty about the future. In verse 20, he continues, "You came only yesterday, and today shall I make you wander about with us when I do not know where I am going. Go back and take your people with you. May the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness." But it refused to abandon David. In verse 21, he makes a powerful vow. "As surely as the Lord lives and as my Lord the King lives, wherever my Lord the King may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be." Accepting this extraordinary loyalty, David allowed Iti and his men to stay with him. The procession continued toward the wilderness in great sorrow. In verse 23, we read, "The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on toward the wilderness. The priests Zadok and Abiathar also came bringing the Ark of the Covenant." But David made another surprising decision. In verse 25, he said, "Take the Ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again." This decision reflected both David's faith and humility. He didn't see the ark as a kind of lucky charm to protect him. Instead, he acknowledged that his return to Jerusalem depended entirely on God's will. In 2 Samuel 15:26, David expresses his complete submission. "But if he says, 'I am not pleased with you,' then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." David also saw a strategic opportunity in leaving the priest behind in the city. 2 Samuel 15:27, he says to Zadok, "Do you not see? Return to the city in peace with your son Ahimaaz and Jonathan son of Abiathar." The priests could serve as spies, sending information about Absalom's plans through their sons. In 2 Samuel 15:28, David explains, "I will wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me." As he climbed the Mount of Olives, David wept, walked barefoot, and had his head covered as a sign of mourning. In 2 Samuel 15:30, we read, "Continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up." During this flight, David received even more disheartening news. Ahiel, his wise advisor, had joined Absalom's conspiracy. In 2 Samuel 15:31, we see David's reaction. Now David had been told, "Ahiel is among the conspirators with Absalom." So David prayed, "Lord, turn Ahiel's counsel into foolishness." David knew Ahiel's advice posed a serious threat. He needed someone to counter that influence. And he found that person in Hushi the Arite, a loyal friend who met him at the summit. In 2 Samuel 15:33-35, David says to Hushai, "If you go with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'Your Majesty, I will be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant,' then you can help me by frustrating Ahiel's advice." David had carefully planned his retreat. Even as he fled Jerusalem with a broken heart, he had not lost his strategic sharpness. with the priests and Hui in place as his eyes and ears inside Absalom's court. David waited in the wilderness for the right moment to respond to his son's rebellion. While David was fleeing into the wilderness, Absalom was entering Jerusalem in triumph. David's plan began to take shape when Hui, his loyal friend, appeared to offer his services to the new king. In 2 Samuel 16:16 we read, "Then Hosea the Arite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said to him, 'Long live the king! Long live the king!'" Absalom was surprised to see Hushai, known to be his father's friend, seemingly switching sides. In 2 Samuel 16:17, he asked, "Is this the love you show your friend? Why didn't you go with your friend?" Hushai responded with carefully chosen words. He didn't lie outright, but spoke ambiguously. In 2 Samuel 16 hours 18 minutes and 19 seconds, he says, "No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel. His I will be, and I will remain with him. Besides, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the Son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you." Meanwhile, Ahil wasted no time in giving advice to Absalom. His first suggestion was shocking and calculated. In 2 Samuel 16:21, he advises, "Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened." This counsel had a strategic purpose to make the rupture between father and son complete and irreversible. In the ancient Near East, taking the king's women was tantamount to claiming his throne. It was a public declaration that reconciliation was off the table. Absalom followed this terrible advice. In 2 Samuel 16:22, we read, "So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel." This action fulfilled the prophecy Nathan had given to David years before, when he said that, because of David's sin with Bathsheba, "Out of your own household, I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight." Ahil then presented his next counsel. In 2 Samuel 17:1-2, he proposes, "Let me choose 12,000 men, and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Strike quickly while David was still tired and disorganized, and target only the king. Once David was eliminated, resistance would likely collapse and the people would return to Jerusalem in peace. In 2 Samuel 17:4, we see that this plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. It was a sound military strategy, but Absalom, perhaps out of caution or divine prompting, decided to consult Hui as well. In 2 Samuel 17:5, he says, "Call also Hui the Arite so we can hear what he has to say." When Hui heard Ahil's plan, he realized he had to act quickly to save David. He knew that if the advice was followed, David would likely be dead by that very night. In 2 Samuel 17:7, Hushai begins his response diplomatically. The advice Al has given is not good this time. He then presents convincing arguments against Ahil's plan, appealing to what everyone knew about David and his men. In 2 Samuel 17:8-9, he argues, "You know your father and his men. They are fighters and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced warrior. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now, he's probably hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom." Hushai continued by painting a frightening scenario of what could happen if the initial attack failed. In 2 Samuel 17:10, he warns, then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a fighter, and that those with him are brave." After undermining Ahithophel's plan, Hushai presented his own strategy, carefully crafted to give David time to escape and regroup. In 2 Samuel 17:11-12, he suggests, "Therefore, I advise that all Israel from Dan to Be, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, and that you yourself lead them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew falls on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive." This proposal appealed to Absalom's vanity, suggesting that he personally lead a massive army and receive the glory of victory. But in reality, assembling such a force would take days, buying David valuable time. Hushai added a dramatic flourish to stir Absalom's imagination. In 2 Samuel 17:13, he says, "If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down into the valley until not even a pebble can be found there." This grandiose, almost comical image of dragging an entire city with ropes showed just how much Hushai was exaggerating to impress Absalom. And it worked. In 2 Samuel 17:14, we see the result. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The advice of Hushai the Arite is better than that of Ahiel." For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahiel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. This was a pivotal moment in the story. Had Ahithophil's advice been followed, David likely would have been killed that very night. But Hushai's intervention changed everything, giving David the time he needed to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with his son's forces. Immediately after the meeting, Hushai informed the priests Zadok and Abiathar about what had happened. In 2 Samuel 17:15-16, he says, "Ahiel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I have advised them differently. Now send a message quickly to David, saying, 'Do not spend the night at the fords in the wilderness, but cross over the Jordan at once. Otherwise, the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up.'" The priest's sons, Ahimaaz and Jonathan, carried this critical message to David, allowing him to escape across the Jordan before Absalom could send troops after him. Meanwhile, Ahiel realized that his advice had been rejected and that Absalom's plan was doomed. In 2 Samuel 17-23, we read of his drastic response when Ahiel saw that his advice had not been followed. He saddled his donkey, set out for his house in his hometown, put his affairs in order, and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. It was a tragic end for a man of great wisdom who had bet everything on the wrong side of a rebellion. His suicide showed that he fully understood what Absalom's decision meant. The inevitable failure of the rebellion and David's ultimate victory. After crossing the Jordan following Hushai's warning, David arrived at Mahanaim, where he began reorganizing his forces. In 2 Samuel 17:27-29, we see how he received unexpected support. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, Machir son of Amiel from Lor, and Barzillai the Galadite from Rolim brought bedding, bowls, and pottery. They also brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds, sheep and cheese from cow's milk for David and his people to eat. For they said, "The people have become hungry, tired, and thirsty in the wilderness." This support was crucial for David and his men, who were exhausted after fleeing Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Absalom had gathered his army and crossed the Jordan in pursuit of David. The decisive battle was drawing near. In 2 Samuel 18-1, David begins organizing his troops. David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. He divided the army into 3 main units led by Joab, Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite, a strategy that would allow for coordinated attacks from different directions. David wanted to lead the troops into battle himself, as he had done so many at times before. In 2 Samuel 18:2, he declares, "I myself will surely march out with you." But his advisors strongly oppose the idea. In verse 3, they argue, "You must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city." There was a practical reason for this advice. David's safety was paramount. If he died in battle, their cause would be lost. But there was also an unspoken truth. They knew David would struggle to fight against his own son. David accepted their counsel and agreed to stay behind. In 2 Samuel 18:4, we read, "The king answered, 'I will do whatever seems best to you.' So the king stood beside the gate while all the men marched out in units of hundreds and of thousands. But before they departed, David gave a command that revealed the inner conflict of a father's heart. In verse 5, he publicly instructs his commanders, 'Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake.' And the text notes, all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. This order put his generals in a tough position. Absalom was the chief enemy, the leader of the rebellion. Killing him would be the fastest way to end the war, but the king had asked that his son's life be spared. At last, the two forces clashed. In 2 Samuel 18:6 we read, "David's army marched out to meet Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. The terrain favored David's smaller but more experienced force, skilled in guerrilla tactics over Absalom's larger but less seasoned army. The result was a decisive victory for David's forces." In verse 7, Israel's troops were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. But the text highlights something remarkable about this battle. In 2 Samuel 18:8, we read, "The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword." This commentary suggests that the forest's difficult terrain caused many casualties. Soldiers got lost, were injured by natural traps, or simply couldn't maintain effective formations among the trees, all of which contributed to Absalom's army's defeat. The choice of battlefield had been crucial. During the battle in the forest, something happened that changed everything. In 2 Samuel 18:9 we read, "Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair while the mule he was riding kept on going." It was a bizarre and even comical situation. The handsome Absalom with his long flowing hair was caught by that very hair in the branches of a tree. The pride he once flaunted had now become his downfall, leaving him helpless and suspended. A soldier saw Absalom in that state and ran to report it to Joab. In 2 Samuel 18:10, he says, "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." Joab couldn't believe what he was hearing. In verse 11, he demands, "What, you saw him? Why didn't you strike him down right there? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." But the soldier replied with wisdom, reminding Joab of the king's explicit command. In verses 12 and 13, he says, "Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. We all heard the king command you, Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. If I had put my life in jeopardy and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me." Joab had no such scruples. In verse 14, we see his decision. "I'm not going to wait like this for you." So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the oak tree. Joab, the pragmatic military commander, made the decision he believed was necessary to end the rebellion once and for all. To him, the king's order to spare Absalom was sentimental nonsense that endangered the entire kingdom. If Absalom lived, the civil war could continue. After Joab struck him, 10 of his armor-bearers surrounded Absalom and finished him off, as recorded in 2 Samuel 18:15. With Absalom dead, Joab immediately halted the battle. In verse 16 we read, "Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. Absalom's body met a disgraceful end." In verse 17 it says, "They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, and piled up a large heap of stones over him." This humiliating burial stood in stark contrast to the monument Absalom had built for himself during his lifetime. Mentioned in verse 18, during his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the King's Valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, "I have no son to carry on the memory of my name." He named the pillar after himself, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. The irony was painful. The man who built a monument to preserve his name was buried under a heap of stones in an unmarked grave in the woods far from his grand but empty memorial. Now someone had to deliver the news of victory to King David. Aim's son of the priest Zadok volunteered, but Joab initially refused. In 2 Samuel 18:20, Joab explains, "You are not the one to take the news today. You may take the news another time, but not today, because the king's son is dead." Joab chose a Cushite to carry the message, likely thinking a foreigner would be less affected by the king's potential rage upon hearing of his son's death. However, after the Cushite left, Ahimaaz pleaded so persistently that Joab finally allowed him to go too. Being faster, Ahimaaz outran the Cushite and arrived first. In verses 25 to 27, we see David anxiously awaiting news and recognizing Ahimaaz by the way he ran. When Ahimaaz arrived, he only gave half the message. In verse 28, he shouted, "All is well," and reported victory over the king's enemies. But when David specifically asked about Absalom, Ahimaaz avoided the question, saying he saw a great commotion, but didn't know what had happened. It was the Cushite who finally delivered the full message. In verse 32, he says, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." It was a gentle and indirect way of saying Absalom was dead. But David understood instantly. David's reaction to Absalom's death was one of profound and overwhelming grief. In verse 33, we read his heart-wrenching lament. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." This outcry revealed the heart of a father who, despite his son's betrayal and rebellion, never stopped loving him. David would rather have died in Absalom's place, no matter how deeply his son had sinned against him. News of the king's reaction spread quickly among the troops. In 2 Samuel 19:2, we read, "The victory that day was turned into mourning for all the troops because the king was grieving for his son." The soldiers who had risked their lives to defend David and restore his kingdom entered the city in silence, as though they had been defeated and were ashamed. In verse 3, it says, "The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle." Meanwhile, David remained inconsolable. In verse 4, we read, "The king covered his face and cried aloud, 'O my son, Absalom! O Absalom, my son, my son!'" This situation placed the army in an awkward and disheartening position. They had fought loyally for their king and won, but instead of a celebration, they found only mourning and sorrow. The troops' morale plummeted. Joab, ever blunt and practical, decided to confront the king. In verses 5 to 6, he entered the room where David was mourning and said, "Today you have humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you." Joab continued his harsh rebuke, pointing out David's ingratitude toward his loyal servants. In 2 Samuel 19-7, he warns, "Today I see that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead, you would be pleased." Then Joab gives the king an ultimatum. In the same verse he says, "Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a single one will remain with you tonight. This will be worse for you than all the troubles you faced from your youth until now." David recognized the wisdom in Joab's stern words. In 2 Samuel 19-8, we read, "So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told, 'The king is sitting in the gateway,' they all came before him." This was a pivotal moment. By appearing in public, drying his tears, and acknowledging his people, David showed that despite his personal grief as a father, he was still the king and recognized the value and sacrifice of his soldiers. Meanwhile, the Israelites who had followed Absalom fled to their homes. In the same verse we read, "Meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes." With the rebellion defeated, a discussion began about bringing David back to his throne in Jerusalem. In 2 Samuel 19-9-10, we see the tribes debating throughout all the tribes of Israel. The people were arguing and saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies and rescued us from the Philistines. But now he has fled the land because of Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do we say nothing about bringing the king back?" Sensing this hesitation, David sent a message to the elders of Judah. In 2 Samuel 19:11, he asks, "Why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his house?" He also sent a special message to Amasa, who had been the commander of Absalom's army. In 2 Samuel 19:13, David promises, "Say to Amasa, 'Are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not the commander of my army from now on, in place of Joab.'" This was a shrewd political move. By offering the command to Amasa, David not only secured the support of a prominent leader from Absalom's side, but also signaled forgiveness to those who had rebelled. At the same time, it served as a form of punishment for Joab, who had killed Absalom against David's explicit orders. The strategy worked. In 2 Samuel 19:14, we read, "He won over the hearts of all the men of Judah as though they were one man. They sent word to the king, 'Return, you and all your men.'" The king then began his journey back to Jerusalem. In 2 Samuel 19:15, we see when the king reached the Jordan, the men of Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. During this journey, David showed great mercy. He forgave Shime, who had cursed at him during his escape, and restored half of Mephibosheth's estate, which had been taken from him due to false accusations of treason. David also honored Barzillai, the elderly Gileadite who had supported him during his exile. In 2 Samuel 19:33-39, we read how David invited Barzillai to live in Jerusalem under his care. But the old man chose instead to return to his homeland. In his place, he sent Chimham, probably his son, to serve the king. David's return, however, was not without conflict. A dispute arose between Judah and the other tribes of Israel over who had more claim to the king. In 2 Samuel 19:41-43, we see how this tribal tension laid the groundwork for future problems. That tension soon led to a new rebellion. A man named Sheba, son of Bri from the tribe of Benjamin, took advantage of the unrest to spark another revolt. In 2 Samuel 21, he declared, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son, every man to his tent, Israel." This uprising showed that the wounds of civil war had not fully healed. In 2 Samuel 22, we see how quickly the situation unraveled. So all the men of Israel deserted David to follow Sheba, son of Bichri. But the men of Judah stayed by their king all the way from the Jordan to Jerusalem. David ordered Amasa, his new commander, to muster the troops of Judah within 3 days to pursue Sheba. But when Amasa took longer than ordered, David sent Abishai with his elite guards. Joab also joined them. When they found Amasa, Joab treacherously killed him and resumed command of the army. In 2 Samuel 20-10, we read of the ambush. Amasa was not on his guard against the dagger in Joab's hand, and Joab plunged it into his belly, and his intestines spilled out on the ground without being stabbed again. Amasa died. Despite this betrayal, Joab remained loyal to David in the pursuit of Sheba. They besieged the city of Abel-Beth-Maachah, where Sheba was hiding. A wise woman from the city negotiated with Joab, offering to hand over Sheba in exchange for peace India. 2 Samuel 20:22, we read how the rebellion ended. Then the woman with her wisdom went to all the people. They cut off the head of Sheba son of Bichri and threw it to Joab. So he sounded the trumpet, and his men dispersed from the city, each to his home. And Joab returned to the king in Jerusalem. The final years of David's reign were marked by further challenges. One of them was a severe famine that lasted 3 years. In 2 Samuel 21, David discovered that the famine was the result of an old injustice committed by Saul against the Gibeonites. Following the customs of the time to make amends, David handed over 7 of Saul's descendants to the Gibeonites, who executed them. Only Mephibosheth was spared due to the oath David had made to Jonathan. After this, God answered the prayers for the land and the famine ended. Another significant event was the census that David ordered. In 2 Samuel 24:1, we read, "Again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go and take a census of Israel and Judah.'" Joab tried to dissuade David from this decision. In 2 Samuel 24:3, he asked, "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my lord the king see it. But why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" Despite the objections, David insisted, and the census was carried out. After 9 months and 20 days, Joab returned with the numbers. There were 800,000 men capable of wielding a sword in Israel, and 500,000 in Judah. But soon after, David felt remorse. In 2 Samuel 24:10, he confesses, "I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing." The prophet Gad came to David with a message from God, offering him 3 options for punishment: 3 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing from his enemies, or 3 days of plague in the land. David chose the plague, saying he would rather fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great than fall into human hands. The plague killed 70,000 people across Israel. But when the angel of destruction was about to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord relented and ordered the angel to stop. In 2 Samuel 24:16, we read, "When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord relented concerning the disaster and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, 'Enough, withdraw your hand.' The angel was at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. Following Gad's instructions, David bought the threshing floor from Araunah and built an altar there to the Lord. In 2 Samuel 24-25, we see the result. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered his prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. That place around threshing floor would later become the site where Solomon would build the temple. What began as a sinful census and painful punishment ended up establishing the future center of worship for all Israel. In his final years, David turned his attention to the succession of the throne. Although Adonijah, his oldest surviving son, tried to declare himself king, David had promised the throne to Solomon, his son, with Bathsheba. In 1 Kings 1, we see how Nathan and Bathsheba warned David about Adonijah's actions. David acted swiftly, ordering Solomon to be anointed king while he was still alive. In 1 Kings 139, we read, Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon. Then they sounded the trumpet, and all the people shouted, Long live King Solomon! Before his death, David gave Solomon final instructions and made preparations for the construction of the temple. He had gathered materials and resources, but the task of building the house of God would fall to his son. In 1 Kings 2:1, David gave his parting words. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. I am about to go the way of all the earth, so be strong. Act like a man and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations as written in the law of Moses. Do this, so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go. These were the final words of David, the shepherd boy who became a king, the warrior who built Israel's greatest empire, the sinner who found forgiveness, and the man after God's own heart. His reign lasted 40 years, 72 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. In 1 Kings 2:10, we read simply, Then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. His son Solomon succeeded him, marking the beginning of a new era for Israel. What an incredible journey we've just taken through. The life of David. We watched a humble shepherd rise to become Israel's greatest king, conquer nations, and build an empire. But we also saw his failures, his mistakes, and how he always returned to God, even in the darkest moments. This story teaches us so much about life. It shows that we all face challenges, we all stumble. But what truly matters is how we respond. David was a man after God's own heart, not because he was perfect, but because he knew how to repent and begin again. If this story touched your heart like it did mine, don't keep it to yourself. Click the subscribe button now so you won't miss the next episodes in this Bible story series. And why not share this video with that friend or family member you know would be blessed by this message? Every share can change a life. Every subscription helps us spread these powerful stories that inspire, teach, and transform. See you in the next episode, where we'll keep exploring the amazing stories from the Word of God. If the story of David moved you like it moved us, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to continue this journey through powerful Bible stories. Share this message of courage, grace, and divine destiny with someone who needs to hear it today.